If you committed a crime in the early days of America, you were going to feel the revenge of the citizenry. You'd be beheaded or hanged, flogged, stretched on the rack, tortured, blinded, tarred and feathered, ridden out of town on a rail, or spread eagled in the stocks for all to gape at. No one pretended they were trying to reform you. They were just giving you your due reward for acting in violation of the community's codes. And it was an instant reward. If your crime didn't warrant beheading or hanging, you had an opportunity to resume your life with the immediate scar of that punishment to remind you of the folly of your old ways. Today, the psychological scars of years of mental and physical torture wipe out any thought of conforming to the society that allowed them to be inflicted. A convict conforms more to what the prison experience teaches, to behave as brutally as those who wield the power and run the institution. I'm certainly not suggesting we go back to the rack or the stocks. I'm just saying that we still haven't found a way of dealing with the so-called criminal element in our culture. People have been trying to find out what makes a person become a criminal for at least the past 200 years, maybe forever. Many theories have been expounded, but all have been rubbed out by each generation's new ideas on the subject. It used to be thought that the devil was to blame. In the 19th century, the English accused criminals of being prompted and instigated by the devil. In 1862, the North Carolina Supreme Court followed its ancestors' train of thought by declaring, "To know the right and still the wrong, pursue the proceeds from a perverse will brought by the seductions of the evil one," whatever the fuck that means. Toward the end of the 19th century, Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso took the blame away from the devil and gave it to God. "Criminals are born that way," he said, "not a variation from the norm, but practically a special species, a subspecies, having distinct physical and mental characteristics." In the 1930s came another theory from a German this time. His studies show that certain physical types were more drawn to crime than others. Men who were stout and squat and had large abdomens were usually the occasional offenders, while slender men with slight muscular builds were most often habitual criminals. The 1940s expanded on this with the gland analysis that named the criminals of the world mesomorphs. In physical type, the mesomorph was the reverse of the previous decade's description of a criminal. Instead of short and fat, the criminals was now thought to be muscular, bear-like, aggressive, noisy, and aggressive. During all these speculations on the physique of the criminal, the doctors who were engaged in the budding new fields of psychology and psychiatry were putting in their 2 cents worth. In 1920, a Princeton psychologist, Dr. Henry Goddard, thought that criminals were people of low mentality, but by 1959, that theory was soundly disproven. Studies of prison populations made by clinical psychologists demonstrate that those behind bars compare favorably with the general population in intelligence. Since we seldom arrest and convict criminals except the poor, inept, and friendless, we can know very little of the intelligence of the bulk of the criminal world. It is quite possible that it is, by and large, superior. Indeed, it is currently held that the criminal mind and the creative mind are but two sides of the same potential, the one being undeveloped, uneducated, and frustrated. More than just the poor, inept, friendless have criminal minds. In the late 1940s, 1,700 anonymous New Yorkers, all in the upper income bracket, who'd never been arrested, answered questions about their criminal activities. It turned out that 91% of them, 64% of the men, and 27% of the women had committed a felony for which they could have been sent to the state pen had they been arrested and convicted. Nevertheless, poverty, it was clear even to theorizers in 1870, was and remains the major factor in the making of a criminal. In the 1870s, the prisons were filled with Irish and Italian immigrants, the young, the poor, and Native Americans. Today, prisons are filled with the new immigrants the country takes in with open arms, open arms that close the moment the boat lands. With our own slum dwellers, with blacks, Chicanos, and poor whites who are disenfranchised by society, as well as young counterculture drug addicts. Why is it the poor are more likely to end up in jail while the more affluent middle class who are committing as many felonies aren't? It's not just a matter of lack of money for legal fees, because the middle class whites aren't even apprehended for their crimes. It's been demonstrated so much in our society of late that it's almost redundant to say it, but the police instantly react to blacks and other ethnic minorities as if they were already criminals. I think they call that profiling. In a book called The Myth of the Criminal Type, the author, Professor Theodore Sarbin, writes, "The belief that some classes of persons were dangerous guided the search for suspects. Laws are broken by many citizens for many reasons. Those suspects who fit the concurrent social type of the criminal are most likely to become objects of police suspicion. To account for the disproportionate number of lower class and black prisoners, I propose that the agents of law enforcement and justice engage in decision making against a backcloth of belief that people can be readily classified into two groups, criminal and non-criminal." The President's Crime Commission confirmed that this was common practice in a 1967 report. Policemen in attempting to solve crimes must employ, in the absence of evidence, circumstantial indicators to link specific crimes with specific people. Thus, policemen may stop Negro and Mexican youth in white neighborhoods, may subject juveniles who act in what policemen consider an impudent or overly casual manner, and may be influenced by such factors as unusual hairstyles or clothes uncommon to the wearer's group or area. Those who act frightened, penitent, and respectful are more likely to be released, while those who assert their anatomy and act indifferent or resistant run a substantially greater risk of being frisked, interrogated, or even taken into custody. For all this, we still haven't determined the root cause of the making of a criminal. The thread that runs throughout every finding, though, is poverty. Financial poverty, opportunity poverty, educational poverty, love poverty, and finally, self-worth poverty. All these begin in childhood. With the majority of criminals who get caught, there is a pattern of one kind of neglect or another in their early family life. My own beginnings are an example. I have certainly known convicts who suffered far more than I did in childhood, but the result is the same: a self-hatred that cannot be tolerated, that must be projected onto the world at large because the pain is too great to face. For most people, but especially for men in this society, anger and rebellion are the response to the wounds of early conditioning. I never really knew my mother or father, particularly my father. He was an alcoholic and died of cirrhosis of the liver after I started my criminal endeavors. When I was 3 years old, my parents divorced and my mother put me in a foster home. I don't know whether she just didn't want me or couldn't take care of me. I never gave it much thought, so it didn't bother me. In other words, I buried my feelings. The family I was farmed out to treated me well enough. They were a German couple who already had grandchildren my age. They were very strict, but fortunately not mean. There were no beatings, but no affection either. My foster father didn't provide me much of a male figure for me to learn from. He worked nights as a baker, came home as I was going to school, said hello, and that was the last I'd see of him until the next morning. My childhood was lifeless, with no emotions of either love or hate, within myself or from others. I deadened my feelings as I saw everyone around me deaden theirs. I spent 15 years of empty time waiting to grow up and be on my own. At 15, I joined the army with a fake ID. When I came out at 18 with an honorable discharge and a few $100s in my pocket, I felt like the world owed me a living. I had no desire to work. Finding a job wouldn't have been easy anyway. I didn't have a high school diploma. I'd left school after finishing the ninth grade. I had a complex about the way I expressed myself, knowing I sounded ignorant. I didn't really have a trade, at least not one I wanted to work at. I'd done some welding and plumbing in the army, but I'd had enough of it. I wanted to do something I hadn't done before. I wanted to be out in the world. Finally, I decided hitchhiking around the country would satisfy my itch for freedom. It did until one morning when I woke up in a Las Vegas motel room with 75 cents in my pocket, feeling broke and desperate, with nowhere and no one to turn to for help. Finally, I decided hitchhiking around the world would satisfy my itch for freedom. It did until one morning when I woke up in a Las Vegas hotel room with 75 cents in my pocket, feeling broke and desperate, with nowhere and no one to turn to for help. I reasoned that with only 75 cents to my name, the need for money seemed more immediate than the need for a job, which would take days to find anyway. A simple robbery seemed the best solution. Fate presented me with the opportunity not 5 minutes later. As I walked into the motel lobby to spend 50 of my 75 cents on a pack of smokes to help me scheme a plan, I saw the manager counting out money from the night's receipts. I thought, this is as good of a time as any. I took out the pocket knife I carried, walked up behind him, put the knife to his back, and told him it was a stick-up. He handed me the money without any fuss and got down on the floor until I left, as I told him to do. I walked out and got on the first bus out of town. I scored $800, more than I could legitimately earn in 6 weeks. It seemed so easy. I kept on pulling bigger and bigger robberies, rationalizing that I'd continue stealing only until I figured out what I really wanted to do in life. Life doesn't work that way though. 3.5 years after I started my criminal career, I got busted. Those first 9 years in the penitentiary didn't do anything to change my mind about crime. When I was finally paroled after becoming one of the hardcore cons, it took only 14 months for me to sink into the despair that led me to robbing so many years before. It was Christmas. I lost my job and my girlfriend, and I was down to my last $30. I felt like I had nothing to lose, even if I go back to Santa Fe, which I did. It was as if life were taking me by the scruff of the neck and saying, look, you sorry sucker, you're going to learn some lessons whether you like it or not. And learn I did in the next 5 years, but not because I had any help from either prison officials or inmates. If it takes 14 years for a penitentiary to reform a man's way of thinking, something's got to be wrong with the system. One of the major things wrong with it is the absence of normal sexual relations. It's perverse to lock up men in their sexual prime and not provide a normal outlet for their erotic desires. Shit, man, let a motherfucker have, they don't even let a motherfucker have fuck books no more in there, man. It's perverse to lock up men in their sexual prime and not provide a normal outlet for their erotic desires. We're dealing with passionate, needing, angry men here, not saints and ascetics ready to take up celibacy. Further, the softness of a female would do a lot to calm down the furies that rage inside an inmate. Not only do prison authorities forbid sexual relations between men and women, they have tight restrictions on how much a man can simply kiss his own wife or his girlfriend during visits. The appetites will be satisfied though, even if reluctantly. It took me 5 years to succumb to the advances of a jailhouse queen. Oh man, you didn't go out like that, did you, boy? During those first 5 years, I relied on my right hand, Palma, and my fertile fantasies like so many other inmates do. But there's no privacy in prison. Masturbation, like sex, has to be public or snuck in corners of darkness. I didn't like myself being with a man sexually or being seen doing it with him. So I soon stopped having sex with the queen and returned to my solitary pleasures. Man, you went out like a straight punk. Many did like being with men. However, many who would not be with them on the street used them in prison to work out their anger along with their orgasms. Rape was the going mode of sexual fulfillment in the prison population in every prison. Prison rape contributes heavily to the ethic of force that dominates every prison. The patterns of prison sex, in fact, raise sharply the question whether a former prison medical officer has called forced segregation of dangerous individuals within a small perimeter makes any sense at all. These sex patterns are one more assurance that most inmates will leave prison more antisocial than they were when they entered. I was initiated into the ritual of prison rape on my first night in population, fortunately as an observer. Some noises near my bunk woke me. When I opened my eyes, I saw 3 black inmates standing over the dude in the bed next to mine. We'd both just come out of quarantine, and, like me, he was young and white. His eyes were wide with fear. One of the blacks held a large knife over his head. "Roll over, boy," he said. Damn, they taking that fucking butt. The chon chon. The kid had no choice. I'll never forget the look on his face as he turned over onto his stomach. He was naked except for the sheet that covered him. The black with the knife pulled the sheet down and mounted him, thrusting his huge cock into the poor guy's ass. Oh, shit. The black with the knife pulled the sheet down and mounted him, thrusting his huge cock into the poor guy's asshole with no pity and no grease to ease the pain. Oh my God, man, he went dry back on that ass. He had to cover the kid's mouth to stifle his screams. When the first one was finished, oh man, that's a fucking foul mess right there, man. When the first one was finished, the other 2 took their turns. By then, the guy's muffled screams had turned into humiliated whimpering. When all 3 were finished, they returned to their beds at the other end of the dormitory. I laid there without moving, just listening to the kids' quiet crying. I stayed awake the rest of the night. It was then I swore I'd become such a hardcore con that no one would ever come near me like that. That's fucking crazy, man. They took this motherfucker's ass.